I learned that there are people who assume that life will include going into House of Lords. That was not my background. You know, I came from a very ordinary working class background, and then got this quite by surprise call from the then Prime Minister to say, would I go into the House of Lords, which, you know, the average age, and it still is probably, I think, about 70, 71. So I was in my late 30s. So it was just a completely different orbit they were propelling me into. I was completely shocked.
And the carpet is all thicker and a different colour, isn't it?
It's red.
House of Commons green.
House of Commons green, House of Lords red. And then when I first went in there, I was just, you know, sort of, I would say slightly starstruck, but also the carpet was very helpful, because if the carpet was red, I was in the right half of the building.
So for you, calling was, in a way, just very unexpectedly being plucked. Did you feel what we might call imposter syndrome?
Well, I had it this morning. You just have to replace the thoughts in your mind with the truth. And it's a constant process, you know, it's take captive every thought.
As leaders, make the effort to learn what we don't know and see what we don't see, and make pathways for people who are not like us.
Yeah, Jesus was very intentional in relationship, and there's nothing fake about intentional building of relationships. I recognise that I'm naturally drawn to the 15-year-old who's turned up at my church without her mum, you know, and is travelling in, because I see myself. I don't necessarily see myself in the struggling, anxiety-ridden 15-year-old who's in with some of the best private schools in London, but Jesus is the same, you know, and it's about seeing that they're made in the image of God.
Thank you so much for being here, Elizabeth. Honestly, I'm so honoured that you've come. So we've got lots of women listening to this podcast from various backgrounds in lots of different careers. Can you just begin by introducing yourself to us a little bit, your background, a bit of your history, maybe a little bit of your career as well?
Yeah, I mean, I was born and brought up in God's own county, forgive Yorkshire. It's called Rutland, in the middle of the country. And I was very rural, a very affluent area of the country. But by the time I was 16, you know, I went to the local state school, Vale of Catmos College, which is what my title in the House of Lords is named after. By 16, I was out of home, working myself to support myself through sixth form college, took my GCSEs whilst living in lodgings, and then thankfully was informally through the church fostered when I was 18. Wow. So, and then from there, you know, did some time doing voluntary service in both Africa and the Caribbean, and then went off to Cambridge to study law. So I've had one of those careers where there was 9 years up in wonderful Manchester, being a barrister and doing a lot of extracurricular stuff.
So hold on, for our American listeners, law in the UK, you can be a solicitor or a barrister, but a barrister kind of verbally presents and advocates in court.
Yeah, right? It's the advocate who goes to court and presents the case in court. And then I left that. I felt I had a calling to come to London to run, at that time, the Conservative Party's Christian Fellowship. So worked in the Conservative Party's HQ for 5 years. And from there, I did a lot of work with ethnic minority communities, particularly obviously the Christian churches. And then from there, the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, appointed me into the House of Lords, and I was, I think, 38 or 39.
So I met you when you were running the Conservative Christian Fellowship in that period, and you invited me to a lunch that David Cameron, who was then leader of the opposition, and I had tiny Benji, my little baby, with me. Do you remember?
Yeah, I do remember that. Yeah, so
it was obviously very memorable for me. And now for him, my son is 15, but he's got this photograph, a press photograph of himself held by.
Oh yes, did he? Yes, he took. Yeah, he took. Yes, I do remember that now. Yeah.
So you have ended up now in the House of Lords, having this amazing career. God kind of has put you in this quite unique and on one level very privileged position, which is just so wonderful to have seen that. Can I ask you, so as a Christian, you were a Christian at school, through university, then obviously you felt that calling into a more ministry role.
Mm-hmm.
Did you envisage calling as something you kind of always knew how it would end up? You knew that you wanted to be in the House of Lords, or you could sort of see that in your future?
No.
How did it unfold?
I learned that there are people who assume that life will include going into the House of Lords. That was not my background. I came from a very ordinary working class background, and for me, I became a Christian at sixth form, and it was when I was in Ghana, out there with Youth with a Mission, that the notion of calling and being involved, and that was where I very much felt that government, and I came from no background, and I think that is something, when I sort of read the book for women, is there's also a bit of a class issue that sort of impinges on progress, or you have to be aware of, I think. And so that was when I thought, no, government is the thing. But then I didn't realise where that would be. I thought that being a barrister, being a lawyer was like government, but very much felt this is not where I'm supposed to be long-term, learned a lot doing it. And then assumed that I would be an elected member of the House of Commons, and tried to stand and stood in a hopeless seat, for the Tories at that time. And then got this quite by surprise call from the then Prime Minister to say, would I go into the House of Lords, which, the average age, and it still is probably, I think, about 70, 71. Yes. So I was in my late 30s. So it was just a completely different orbit they were propelling me into. I was completely shocked that this would be the suggestion that I should go in and do this. For many reasons. I was young, I was unknown.
Female,
yes. Although David Cameron did a lot to appoint. He appointed a lot of the younger, as in their 30s and 40s, but he put a lot more women in as well at that time. But yeah, also from the background I came from, I'd often been, because I was running the Conservative Christian Party, I visited MPs, but it's like two different workplaces. Yes. So even going into that side of the building, it's like, I've never been in here. What is this?
And the carpet is all thicker and a different colour, isn't it?
It's red.
House of Commons green.
House of Commons green, House of Lords red. And then when I first went in there, I was just, I would say slightly starstruck, but also the carpet was very helpful, because if the carpet was red, I was in the right half of the building, but I was often thinking, where am I? What am I doing?
Amazing.
Yes, yeah.
So for you, calling was, in a way, just very unexpectedly being plucked upwards into this extraordinary and quite unique position. Did you feel what we might call imposter syndrome?
Well, I had it this morning. I got up and thought, why does anyone want to talk to me? Isn't
that, let's just stop and let that sink in for a moment. Listeners, a woman that I just respect so much, who's gone to Cambridge University, having really faced adversity as a young person, who's had a career as a barrister, which is really hard to do.
Yeah.
Who's then been called by the Prime Minister into the House of Lords as one of the youngest women, and you would still have to deal with those feelings of why me and what have I got to say?
Yeah, but you recognise now where it's coming from, and it's being transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Yes.
You're like, okay, I've got something that I need to say this morning. But I think,
tell us that. What are the strategies? Because I think that's so interesting and helpful.
You just have to replace the thoughts in your mind with the truth. And it's a constant process. It's take captive every thought. And it's about replacing it with no. I am a child of God. I have something to say, and then obviously you pray that Lord, give me wisdom as I speak. But it's a constant battle and dealing with those lies in your mind.
Yeah. And I feel, so one of the things I talk about in the book is that I think when I was younger, I looked at people like in a position that you're in now, or even in the kind of position that I'm in now, where you might speak to large numbers. I thought, when you're older or more advanced, you won't even have the struggle anymore. And for me, it's less than it was, certainly.
Yeah.
But I think that's really helpful for people to hear how you press through, and it's the word of God and meditating on the truth and thinking the Christian life isn't about arriving.
Yeah.
You know, we're pressing through.
Yeah. It's a long obedience in the same direction as Eugene Peterson says, attribute it properly. But I think going back to calling, I was probably in a helpful position in that I had no family expectations. There was nothing coming, you know, like you are expected to do this and this. Or so for me, as someone who came and I didn't grow up in a Christian household, who came to a Christian faith in my sort of, you know, in my sixth form years, it was suddenly like, there is a purpose, there is a plan to your life and a path to go down. It then took another, I can't remember how many years, but probably about 18 years for that plan to come to fruition with that phone call from the Prime Minister or Prime Minister's Chief of Staff to say, you know, would like to appoint you.
This.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. So one of the things, I guess, in your particular calling is that you're required to speak.
Yeah.
And speaking in the House of Lords is pretty daunting. Just bear in mind, again, for listeners not from the UK, you'll be there with former High Court justices and, you know, former senior people from the military. It's a group of people that have been selected for outstanding careers and service, isn't it? I mean, obviously, there are probably some people in there who donated a lot to a political party, I guess.
Yeah.
And there are some hereditaries still at the moment, but a very impressive group of people. So your job involves standing up and speaking.
Yeah.
Can I ask, what has it looked like for you to really find your voice?
That's a really interesting question. I think it just flows out of who you are and what your experience is. And I have, you know, my own particular style of speaking. I'm quite passionate. It doesn't matter what you put in front of me. I was talking about radio licences actually only a couple of weeks ago for Rutland. Rutland Radio had some problems. So there I'm in the Lords helping the MP to put some amendments about. I found myself getting very passionate about local radio licences. So that is my style. And actually, I said to myself this morning about something I was thinking about church. Oh, you need to take the emotion out of that, Elizabeth. And I thought, why do I tell myself I need to take the emotion out of that? It's really important. And actually, obviously, uncontrolled emotion is inappropriate. But having emotion and passion in how you speak and what your voice is. And I use a lot of colloquialisms, and there's normally a thread through even my speech on Rutland Radio. But I have found from the very beginning, going back to I can see myself age 14, 15 in an English class in the library at my school. I recognised I had a voice. I recognised I had this gift to speak publicly and communicate. And so that has taken various forms. I mean, when I first spoke in the House of Lords, it was like your first day in court. You stand up thinking your legs are not going to hold you and you're going to just collapse. And and there were, you know, former Supreme Court judges. The people who ran the country as I was growing up were now my peers.
Yes.
And, you know, when I would approaching former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, and calling him Lord Lamont. And he said, no, I'm Norman to you. And I was like, wow, right, this is a bit strange. And the people who'd written the textbooks I learned from, I'm like, they're my colleagues. Oh my goodness. So, it was sort of daunting from that perspective. But if you respect the environment you're in and the history that it's got, but still it's that challenge, like, you know, it's got a particular culture. It's got a particularly strong club-like culture. You know, we still have, you know, and that, I think finding your voice and your place when actually the building and the environment was created from a different era and isn't the kind of environment I was educated in. There are people for whom that is their normal environment, and they've known that from very young. But I think that also as well, finding your voice in that, and outside of the chamber, of like, how are you going to function in that environment? And in the early days, obviously, everybody thought I worked either for Parliament or I was an MP's researcher or something, got lost at the other end of the building.
This young woman.
Yeah. And also, it was very much, how do I dress?
Yeah. So how did you navigate that? Because again, in the book, I talk about that, but obviously more from a setting of thinking about turning up to different kinds of environments, not overdressing for certain environments, not underdressing for others, but how on earth does a new member of the House of Lords sort out her wardrobe?
Well, you know, I had advice from people. I did think about going on Trinny and Suzanne at that time and thinking, how do you dress me? Because I wanted to be professional.
Yes.
All I had was black barrister suits, so one really had to start again. Professional, but not looking too young. Serious professional, but not sort of becoming quite dull in how I dress. And this was an era. It is very different now. But when I joined, that the women who were my colleagues were wearing jewels.
Wow.
To work, and I'm like thinking that's not fake. That is real, you know. And so you can't be that, obviously.
No.
And so I went for what I felt comfortable in, but I thought this is smart. This is and it has got more relaxed and more informal.
You're probably making a way for others then as well, who will all have the same feeling.
Yeah, I think a lot of them do, and still sort of a bit concerned. But I always remember a reception with the Lord Speaker, so that's the person who convenes the chamber. And I'm there, and I had on some earrings, and there was a little group of us, of colleagues, this other peers, and she just said, "Oh, Elizabeth, I love your earrings. Are they real?" And it was like asking me my age. You know, everybody around froze. And I looked at her and I said, "Oh, I dream of having jewellery that requires a safe." And everybody laughed, and I thought, you owe me. You owe me big time. I've just dug you out of your hole there. So it was funny to give sort of that kind of thought to, because as a barrister, it was very easy. There was a dress code for court and etc. Yeah. But and it is, as most workplaces have, they've got more informal. And I think this slight turn back to it's got too informal.
Yes. But it's something that women in so many different spheres of life have to think about. So I'm glad it's not just me.
It certainly isn't just you.
Okay, so my next question is, what does it look like for you integrating your Christian faith with the work that you're doing? I'd love to hear that. So we've had bankers and we've had analysts and consultants on the show, and so for you, someone working in public life, what can you give us a flavour of that?
I mean, a colleague once asked me, "What kind of Christian are you?" And I said, "I'm a stick of rock kind of Christian." I said it goes all the way through, like Blackpool, and he laughed. But I thought, that is, I think it integrates everything that you're doing, and how you treat everybody, how you approach writing speeches, how you conduct yourself, and also particularly I think how you say sorry, and the fact that you are holding yourself to account all the time, that actually there is that place to say, "Oh, Stacey, I got that wrong," or whatever.
Yeah, I bet that's pretty rare with very high powered people.
Yeah,
or maybe not.
Well, it's partly, I think it's it's more because it's quite hierarchical. It's more when you apologise to staff,
people,
that actually, oops, sorry, and they look at you. When you treat people with what you consider to be ordinary politeness, and they're thanking you, I'm thinking, this is just a really weird environment. I've just been ordinary. I'm not going to push in the queue or whatever. And obviously when I also think about the subject matter that I'm dealing with, I am trying to think about, biblically about how
think it through
and how it is, which is very challenging because of course we're dealing with legislation across multiple government departments, and you can't have a handle on all of that. And so
you've had a particular interest in religious freedom and in human rights as well. Would you say that there's been a kind of underpinning, at least personally for you, of that idea of the image of God and the kind of dignity of the person as the Bible envisages human life?
Yeah, I mean, the career that I've had for 13 years has had careers within it.
Yes.
So I started off doing human rights work and domestic human rights work because of the committee I was serving on. And then I did begin the work along with a small group of people who were in different roles at that time, How Things Begin, the work on freedom of religion or belief. And yeah, that was very much about, if you think it through theologically, you're actually concerned about the persecuted church, but you're concerned about people whose freedoms are to hear that message and they haven't yet heard it. So you're like actually standing up for everybody on an equal platform and not using the freedom of religion or belief to actually as a covert for actually I really just care about the Christians, which can be a message. So really saying it's about the image of God and allowing people the freedom to access not only their own faith but to hear the message of Jesus was really foundational.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Well,
no, it is, because
thank you.
often Christians are perceived as, and probably are actually in that kind of arena, kind of selfishly, like quite focused, or not selfishly, individualistically, but thinking about our community, our rights.
Yeah.
What
and
we
using,
want is being eroded.
Yeah, and wanting and somehow the care for the other just becomes, without saying it out loud, a vehicle to promote what is happening to your own community. But I think what I found in my career is actually, I worked on that for 7 or 8 years, did a university project. Other people came into the arena, and then realising actually my role's over. I need to.
So knowing when to move on.
When to move on.
Okay,
yeah.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Because I think that's huge in leadership. And I don't know if this is true of women in general, but certainly of me in particular. I think it's a weakness that I have and that other female friends I know have, is that we perhaps have a tendency to stay longer at things that men might have realised sooner. I don't know whether that's too much of a generalisation, but how do you do that well? That's such a practical...
I'm not sure I did it that well. I mean, I did leave the CCF well, and that was a completion. And
the CCF is
the Conservative Christian Fellowship. Sorry,
yes.
Yeah, so the role for 5 years. So left that well, and didn't keep a foot in that door.
No, didn't keep trying to control it, pull strings.
No, I was like, and also it was about, what does the organisation need now? I've been enormously blessed, and it's from that platform that the Prime Minister knew me. But actually what the organisation needs now is not some part-time person who's trying to do the House of Lords. And I'd promised to be a working peer. Yes. So we have different people who come in very part-time because they've got big responsibilities outside. But I promised I would come. I thought I can't honour that. No. And also, so actually the organisation needs someone full-time, so that's not me. So leaving that well. And then leaving the freedom of religion. But that was really hard. I very much felt the pull of to go into government. This is the moment to go into government.
So you were offered a ministerial role?
I started on that road. I offered to be a party whip, and then I thought, yes, I am prepared to be a government whip. I'm not sure I left that as well, because I suddenly got caught up in this. So I just think, actually, if I had my time over, and this is maybe something to talk about later, is failure. You know, how we deal with when we think we've made mistakes and failure as women. I think we tend to over-condemn ourselves. We'll come back to that. But anyway, so I left, and I remember the very first, I was a government whip. So that means you've joined the government and you are number 2 supporting the ministers in the Lords in a number of government departments. And I remember going for one of my very first meetings in the department where the Secretary of State was going to be and all the ministerial team. And I'm just thinking, I'm praying, going, Lord, what have I done? What have I done? I was doing all of that work. I've now left the human rights, the freedom of religion and belief. I've left all of that behind. Is this really, what have I done? And then I was in one of the government departments, and the most senior civil servant who runs the department for the ministers came up to me as I'm sort of waiting outside the meeting, and everybody knows each other. I'm standing there thinking, what am I doing? And he comes up and says, oh, Elizabeth, it's really nice to meet you. I heard you speak at a Christian festival last year, New Wine. And I was like, oh, great, Peter, fantastic. And to me, it was just as I'm standing there just praying, like, Lord, what have I done? It was just like a little kind of, you've gone through the right door. It's okay.
Yes.
But it is unusual to
have that.
To actually never suffer from founder syndrome. To actually my role is over. Actually, there are other people whose role it is now. And then when I came out of government at the other end, so I had a career in government, I thought, no, I don't go back. To go back is trespassing. It is other people's call, and they're not mine.
Okay, so how did you know that? Because that's one of the questions, isn't it? So there's a difference between obedience. So once you know you're meant to let go, doing it, that's hard. But one of the dilemmas is actually knowing it, isn't it? It's like, I love the fact that you obviously do hear from God in quite a clear way, because you just knew. But how did you know?
I think when you mentioned that, it reminded me of the move from being a barrister to move to London. And a friend of mine said, oh my goodness, because I was like probably early 30s, I got a good career, bought a house and whatever. And he said to me, gosh, you're really brave, like leaving everything back and going. And I remember, I don't think I said it, but saying to myself, oh no, the brave thing is to stay. Because I fear God, and if God has called me to go, I blooming well better go.
Exactly.
And I just have that sense of the blessing that you have is gone. He's asked you to go. But similarly, in some ways it was more practical. So I looked at the people who are now doing it, like Fiona Bruce MP is the Prime Minister's ambassador for freedom of religion and belief. I was thinking, my role's over here. You know, and the work has got to a different thing. The thing that the group of us, there were people in this, as I say, different roles. It's never one individual. The things we'd campaigned for, there she is doing the reality of what we campaigned for. So
there's a kind of release in that.
It's like, and also some very good advice. I have always had an accountability group of people around me who meet me once a term. And one of them, she's fabulous. And I think it's good advice. She said, life is rarely about going back. Life is generally a forward trajectory.
Wow.
And I thought, actually, and I do think there's a lot of examples in scripture that I think, that is generally, there are occasions where God calls you back, but generally,
don't look back.
Don't look back.
Press forward
and go on. As tempting as it is to go back to the thing that you know and the comfort zone, etc. But
that is so encouraging. So we were talking a bit earlier, and we kind of segued and said, we'll move on to think about that. And you mentioned something that is so important in growing as a leader, which is a healthy response to failure. And it's one of the things that I talk about a bit in the book is an experience in an organisation I worked for, and really kind of reflecting on what I feel my own failures were as well. It's hard to do, isn't it? And it feels quite a vulnerable thing to do. Can you talk a bit about what you were alluding to before? What do you think the importance of this is?
I'm sitting here doing a podcast and thinking of the people who maybe I think didn't have the best experience working for me. You make your mistakes along the way, and I think particularly as you grow in your faith and hopefully do that interior work, and realise where you're coming from. So a lot of when I sort of look back, I had to realise that because of where the circumstances of particularly my teenage years, I was fight or flight. So there was only an accelerator. And therefore working for me, and I love ideas, was just like a workload that I placed on myself, but then of course not realising that this had ripples and ramifications for people around you. And you then,
I'm definitely guilty of that as well, because you don't realise what your own pace is, and others may not feel comfortable
and may not have that capacity, and you're not leading in that way. And particularly the roles I've been in as a barrister and then as a backbench peer and running a small organisation, you've not got proper accountability around you, and people are praising you. You have to sort of draw that in. And obviously when you spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast in Westminster, about forgiveness in public life, you can, if you have a wrong response, to think, well, I'm now disqualified because I've made these mistakes, I'm now disqualified. But actually realising that, when I was in government as a minister during the pandemic, in the Department for Education, so we had to close schools. It was just
traumatic.
It was awful. And realising that you had a lot of responsibility but very little control in some respects because it's a pandemic. But actually realising at that point that the things you could do was hopefully be a really good boss to the people around you. When you were seeing them, obviously we had to go into work, you were seeing people who weren't seeing their parents.
No. Or anyone,
No human contact, except what was before you.
Yeah.
And one of the main things I had in my mind is, when this is over, I don't want them to be burnt out. As much as I can control what's happening. And I was very clear, and hopefully what I modelled to them was, I had a day off. We were in a pandemic, but whatever. I had a Sabbath.
Yeah.
There was an emergency, and I can remember it now. Absolutely fine to disturb me then, and I disturbed them actually, like with what was going on. But apart from that, but it is hard to deal with that failure and realise, actually, because your failure in public life is very obvious. It's public. And that's why I think we're struggling for people wanting to come into public life. And
because it's so frightening, because we are all going to fail. I think it's true.
And people are hurt by your failure. I think I found that really hard when I look back and you get that crystal clear vision. You think, people were hurt by my failure. I didn't do it intentionally, but people were hurt by my failure. And that to me is just that, I think, forgiving yourself, that actually leadership is a learning process. And particularly, unlike being in a large corporate or a large organisation where you've got a lot of support, as I say, the roles I have done.
You're quite individual.
Individual. And I feel it as well, particularly like when my own church, for instance, has not got a vicar. And I'm like, very much, how do we create a healthy organisation, not just get a new vicar, a healthy organisation that provides that support? Because many vicars now have got like 8-10 staff and no HR function. I'm like, I think they might be spending a lot of their time, if they're going to run it well, doing appraisals, I'm like thinking, so it's realising that actually a lone operation it has its vulnerabilities.
Thank you so much for speaking honestly about that. I know that leaders of all ages are processing exactly what you've talked about. How do I healthily navigate failure and, having hurt people along the way, often unintentionally, and that being a different category from actually abusing people.
Oh gosh,
where there needs to be a whole layer of accountability, but those things often becoming so jumbled in people's minds and perhaps in your own mind. So being someone, and you mentioned the accountability group that you have, but one of the key themes I think that also helps with this with leaders is the theme of friendship. Do we have people in our lives that really know us, that warts and all, not the sort of polished version, but the real us? Can you talk a bit about the role of friendship and the importance of friendship in the life of a leader?
I realised the mistakes I made, and particularly the mistakes I made then being government minister, were not having those people close enough to you. So I think it's biblically modelled. It's John, it's Peter, James and John. And there's a stability to that actually that I think sometimes we don't take into account here, that we're often rolling into, because life's transient. So I have probably two people I think of as mentors, and they know everything, like everything.
Okay, hold on. How long does that take for them to know everything? Like, what's the time investment there? Is that like, because they've known you a long time, obviously cumulatively that ends up being a lot of time. But how often then do you check in with them once they really do know you?
I probably have a lengthy phone call with a lady in her 70s, probably every week to 10 days. I'm not talking an hour plus. And she's the person that I tell all those the things that are hidden sins that you just need to get into the light and say, this is what's going on.
This is happening.
This is what is happening, and therefore she needs to know that. And the other one, and it's interesting to have very different people. So the other one, and this lady, Pauline, has known me since I was 17 in the Baptist church. I became a Christian. The other one is Nimsa Bungay, who's a black Pentecostal church leader. So you couldn't actually probably get, one's living in Suffolk, the other one's in Tottenham.
Love it.
And so
there's actually a really healthy balance there.
They're very different. And when I want to check in and just say, is my compass correct? This is what's happening, and I think whatever. And particularly Nims knows me well enough that he can just let me talk, and then he just gets hold of me, and then he makes me shut up. You know, it's like, stop, just listen. At this point, so I've got them. But then in terms of when I went into the House of Lords, I was aware of this lack of HR. I was entering a world I just didn't know. So that it has changed in terms of the individuals over the years, except for one lady who's been there from the very beginning, who knew me from Manchester, and who's wonderful lady who stuck with it. And we meet usually once a term, and they know everything that's happening about all of my life. So not just work, but my family, my finances, you know,
Wonderful.
All of what's happening and the challenges. And it's been robust over the years. Honestly, it's been, I mean, one time I think they realised they'd gone a bit too far, so they sent me flowers after the meeting, because it was just
Did you leave in tears?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was just like, you know, and it was part of that process of like far too much work, taking on too much, all crashing, them not being able to work out exactly. So there's this new thing and that, and yeah, they did. They sent flowers because it was a bit too much. but it's very important that they are there, and they've been consistently there for, it would be now 13 years, meeting with me and trying to help that. So those friendships, I mean, you can't create them overnight. But I sometimes look at the younger women coming up after me and just think, sometimes I find, maybe it's because they're obviously a different generation Y, Generation Z. I was thinking, sometimes they're not. I always wanted the older person. So when I was in church in Manchester for 9 years, I had a lady, Isabel, who had been a consultant radiologist, and I met with her every week or two, maybe every couple of weeks, and we prayed together, we studied together, we did that, and I wanted that layer down. And I sometimes find that the next generation, do they want that layer down? I'd love to, you know, I try and draw people in, but I sometimes find it's like, okay, so I've got nothing to teach you. That's fine. If that's what you want, that's absolutely fine.
Is that expressed verbally or non-verbally?
No, but you just kind of get there. You're like, okay, we're not going, you know.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know whether it is a generational thing, but I think it's biblical. The older met and the older one.
But it's the younger issue, surely, isn't it? The desire to grow and learn.
But it's also, I think, maybe from when I'm sort of thinking, I relate to that in the sense that if you're working class, we're getting into the class thing now, and you've sort of succeeded, and you've broken through, and you're in your 20s and 30s, and you've broken through, and it's like, and you've achieved, and the confidence, and you're out there, but you're not seeing that actually this is a long obedience, and actually that kind of invincibility that goes with being younger, and you're like, okay, you know, but
so maybe that will be a need that actually arises in crisis, or when there's a moment of but it'd be better to have it in place. So everyone listening to this is absolute gold from Elizabeth. Really think about this. Consider who have I got in my life? Who do I need to be seeking out? In a way, the book, Lead Like the Real You, was written to kind of meet that need for mentorship, because I have actually found myself overwhelmed with requests of women who want to be in kind of public Christian ministry, because there are so few of us who are a bit older, you know.
But when you mentioned about crisis, I've had the privilege of knowing for many years Pastor Aguruku, who leads a church Redeemed church in North London.
I think for listeners not from the UK, I think that's the largest church network in the UK.
Yeah, it's the British Nigerian network, and
extraordinary man of God.
He is fantastic. And his phrase, and he doesn't write books. He's not a celeb, but you know, he is a real leader. He said, "You don't." He lost his first wife to cancer when his children were pretty young, and he said, "You don't build your storm shelter in the storm," and you don't. Good. And that's what I sometimes feel for there are, you know, those below me who are like, yes, we regularly meet and whatever, but I just think you don't build your storm shelter in the storm, and you're going to get hit by a storm, and you've not got the things around you to withstand that. And that's when you need those people, and you need to be the person that's there for other people when the storms hit them. It's a two-way thing.
Yeah.
And actually,
but the storm is coming.
The storm is coming.
Parable about the rock and the sand.
It's coming.
The storm isn't questioned. Yeah. The question is what you built on.
So I periodically write like a Venn diagram. I put myself in the middle, and I try and put the people, both Christians and those who are yet to know the Lord, in different, and try and work out. And that helps you prioritise your diary, particularly, travel at the weekends and who you're going to go and see, where those people are. And people will move over time. But generally, there's a consistency around the people who you've allowed in.
And there's an investment required.
Absolutely, and a commitment to them as they commit to you.
Very good. Okay, let's talk about class, because that's come up a few times.
Yeah.
And again, for our US listeners or people outside the British system, they'll probably be aware of class being quite a big thing here.
Yeah.
I was just saying to you before we recorded that I always feel slightly uncomfortable because I don't really know where I fit in our system, which is partly because my dad is German and then my parents pastored, and I really kind of grew up in the inner city, but also had this amazing education opportunity. So educate us about class, Liz, and talk about what it means to lead and break through and overcome when class doesn't feel like an advantage, maybe?
Well, I think as you're growing up, I think sometimes I was very aware that, because I grew up in a small town, there's one comprehensive, so publicly funded school, and there's one private school. And so that they are the wealthy, privileged, and you are not.
Yeah.
It's different now because my old state school is absolutely fantastic. And so people are like really wanting to move to the area to get to that school. But you are aware that there is this thing, and you're separate as well. There's a separation in a small market town. They use one news agency, you use another news agency. And the public and state schools generally in my era, they don't play sport against each other. The private schools play against each other and the state schools play against it. So you've got this separation as well. And I think it's easier in a city like London when it's just a pop. But in a small place, it's very prominent there. And, and just, I think when you sort of go into the environments, like not knowing, even like we said before, the buildings, when I went for my interview at university, this looked like some kind of National Trust property.
I had the same at Oxford. I was so overwhelmed.
I
should have actually gone in advance to see it, because I just remember thinking.
But you've never visited these places. We didn't. We did caravan holidays. We didn't do culture. We didn't go to museums. We did occasionally go to a stately home, and that's what it looked like. I'm going for an interview in a stately home. And so that, thankfully the person who interviewed me kind of got all of this, that, interviewed me very well because they knew where I'd come from, and also they knew the circumstance I was living in at the time. But yes, you go through, and these institutions and environments have been formed by a particular culture and mentality, and you're entering into them, and it's like you're made to be welcome, but you're welcome, but don't change us. We kind of quite like what we're doing at the moment. Don't bring your attitudes and I think racially it's hard to unpick what is race and what is class sometimes of going into institutions. And then, you're just finding, so I should have learnt to ski. Oh, right, okay. There's all these things that you're just thinking, and camp. That's another one. I'm like, no, we never camped. Camping was like, so, it's quite funny getting to know the British black community really well, because they don't camp generally. They don't camp. And I'm like, I'm with you. We don't camp. There is no ensuite. There's no whatever. I'm not doing that camping stuff. And so you just realise, and it's not that anybody's articulating this, but
it's these unspoken thing
that's being, it's been created for you. And then also when so it and the church, I came to the Christian faith in a Baptist non-conformist, and this in a small market town, so anybody and everybody is there. And then I encounter Christian Union at university and discover, oh my goodness, I'm encountering
different world.
Class massively here, and all of the kind of different.
And very male.
Very white male orientated. And then, and then realising that, of course, and I think sadly, the evidence, the Talking Jesus research does still bear this out, that particularly within the Church of England churches, they do poor very well, they do wealthy very well, but the bit in the middle, the social class, we say D and E.
Yeah.
I mean, have you ever heard of a church needing to move their services around a shift pattern?
No.
Or the Deliveroo drivers or the whatever? It's that, what I would call, I don't like to use class terms, but I probably would say it's the bottom half of what we would call standard rate taxpayers. And
yes.
they're just not there.
Yeah.
They're in the Catholic.
Listening to Jordan Peterson.
Sorry.
They are listening to Jordan Peterson and engaging with ideas and, meaning of life.
Absolutely. They're human like the rest of us. And the number of times I've said to people, there are no 20s and 30s around our church. I'm like, yes, there are, but they're probably living at home with their parents. They never went to university. And by the way, the majority of 18-year-olds don't go to university and they can't afford the rent. So they're like, oh, really? I'm like, yeah, I think if we knock the doors, we'll find, So it's that. So encountering it in the church is I think that's also just adds a different layer, and an institution that has been it's hard to see it when you're in an institution and
you don't know what you don't know.
You don't know what you, and to many people, that's just normal behaviour.
Okay, so as leaders, then part of being someone who is empathetic, someone who is empowering others, is to make the effort to learn what we don't know and see what we don't see, and make pathways for people who are not like us. Yeah. And to, I guess, be grateful where forebears have gone before us, because, obviously we're talking as women, and 50 years ago, 100 years ago, even 30 years ago, women were not operating in the same way.
No. But I think you have to be intentional as well.
Yeah.
I think
relationships.
Yes, I think people think that friendship. It's easy to make friends with people who are very similar to you. I mean, when I meet with my friends who are from a working class background, it's just really easy. It's not so easy, really, and I think we don't realise sometimes that Jesus was very intentional in relationships, and there's nothing fake about intentional building of relationships. As long as you're there, you're not wanting to use someone or anything. You intentionally reach out to somebody who is really different to you. And so for me, that can be somebody. Some of my good friends at work are hereditary peers. They do own estates. They have got a castle,
and the real jewels.
And the real jewels in the safe, And when I look at who I'm godparent to,
that's so wonderful.
It's everything from, the sort of the daughter of a Scottish clan to a first generation British Eritrean refugee.
Praise God.
But you do have to be intent. And I recognise that I'm naturally drawn to the 15-year-old who's turned up at my church without her mum, and is travelling in, because I see myself. I don't necessarily see myself in the struggling, anxiety-ridden 15-year-old who's in with some of the best private schools in London, but Jesus is the same, and it's about seeing that they're made in the image of God, and actually being aware of where your weaknesses are. My weaknesses are not reaching out to that 15-year-old and yet being naturally drawn to the other one.
Yeah. That's amazing, Liz. You're amazing.
I know to say. I'll quote my theologian friend Simon Ponsonby, Jesus is amazing.
But so is Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got time for a couple more questions. Right. You've been so generous with your time. Thank you. Penultimate question is, what would you say to younger Christian women who are interested in politics, public life, who don't know for sure that's where God's called them, but sort of perhaps sense as they're listening to you, a stirring in that direction? What advice would you give to the younger you, or younger people who are, open to that, but are perhaps thinking, maybe I couldn't do it, or I don't know. There are all the reasons why they might count themselves out. But what would you say? What advice would you give?
I mean, we've covered the reaching out for somebody who's one or two steps in front of you. So I would really countenance that. But I'd really Yeah, I mean, I think with calling or whatever, when I look at there's a whole group of us who started out in conservative and who were Christian politics. People went on varying different directions. Some ended up in the House of Commons, one or two of elected representatives. One or two of us ended up in the House, or some people ended up in like the non-government sort of organisations, doing policy work there. Others ended up in local government. So holding it lightly and exploring. Do not invest your identity. Do not invest your identity in an outcome that you can't control.
That's very powerful.
You know, hold it lightly. And it was only at the moment when I laid everything down that actually, you know, like it's not worked out, Lord. I'm not in the House of Commons. It's not gone, whatever. You know.
What you're expecting.
Yeah, that's when the phone call came. You know, so you don't hold it and don't make, you know, the key decisions on life about like, because I'm going to get to that destination, because you don't know what the call is. And God, it's frustrating because God sometimes takes us down processes and applications for various things. And we don't get the outcome. And you're like, well, what was all that about? Well, it was about the training, and it's about that little room in your heart that actually I'm going to go in and clean out at the moment. And you think, really, that one? That was a really difficult one to clean out. So the process, so God can be asking you to go through that process, and there's a very different outcome for you at the end.
Yeah. Okay, I'm actually going to add in one more question.
Super not.
You so kindly gave an endorsement for the book.
Yeah, I did.
Like the real you.
And I did read the whole thing.
The whole thing. And I know you were at a time personally in life where you had so much happening, so I'm so grateful for that.
It's a pleasure.
Can you just briefly say what you liked about it? What did you find connected for you?
I particularly liked your confession that you had like gone at full steam and hurt people. I think, that one relating to that. But I found the middle section particularly interesting around the organisation failure and around abuse. And because I do think as Christians, we don't really understand evil. And I think we can understand quite a lot about the characteristics of evil. And when I was in my government role, I was in charge of the policy around safeguarding in schools. And we had a national sort of moment around the murder of a young woman, and we had something called Me Too campaign. And that all happened whilst I was in government, and I was also the Minister for Women. When I came off this Zoom call, said, "You don't seem surprised, Elizabeth." And I'm like, nah, I said, I have quite a sophisticated understanding of evil. Yes. You know, it doesn't come to an interview with a Halloween costume. No. It masquerades as good. And so it is actually hard to spot, and paedophiles will be good with children. Yeah. And it was interesting, we had a really good discussion around evil and its characteristics. And so, I just found that part of the book really useful around power and abuse and calling things out. And it's a really lonely place to call things out. And yet, if you don't call things out, I think there's a selfish sort of, motivation to calling things out, which is you won't sleep at night. And I look back at all the decisions, hundreds and hundreds of decisions that I made during the pandemic. And I just think, no, I don't lose any sleep. I don't lose any sleep over the decisions that I made, particularly around safeguarding children.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay, so the last question is, what one thing would you like to say to your younger self, or by extension, the younger women listening to this, engaging with this, Christian women in all sorts of walks of life with their life ahead of them, all the different careers that are happening, different family situations. So, the book was predicated on the idea of what would it have been helpful to know 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I'm sorry, because I took the opportunity to write 40-something letters, and I'm never singing to one. But as we close this interview, what would be that one thing?
I think I read it on the tube on the way, the underground tube on the way here. I just started reading Andrew Murray, Humility. And it says that humility is not self-condemnation. And I think I would say to myself, don't be so hard on yourself. And I think as a Christian, knowing the difference between the Holy Spirit's conviction, which is laser of, and
Specific.
Yeah. This is, and we've all felt it. It's like, and condemnation.
Yeah.
There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And I think if I'd have known and discovered more of that, I look back at years and years of just self-critique, self-condemnation. So don't be so hard on yourself. Trust the Holy Spirit to do his job.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I thought was conviction is actually just my own self-condemnation and my own analysis of myself. They are different things. I'm not saying you don't analyse how you're behaving, but it shouldn't lead to condemnation. It leads to helpful kind of, I think, improvement and transformation. So the difference between those. So humility is not self-condemnation.
Wow, that is powerful.
Andrew Murray, I'm quoting.
Thank you, Elizabeth, a woman who has lived that out beautifully and battled through and contended in the most wonderful way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy, and I look forward to my copy of the book.
Yes, you will get it, I promise you. So thank you, Baroness Berridge.
Pleasure. Thank you.